Welcome to Coast with DLA Piper, where we talk about recent developments, hot topics, and trends in employment law. I'm your host, Sherelle Glim from our New York employment team, and we are joined today by Joe Piesco, a partner in our employment group in New York. So, Joe, today we are talking about the U.S. Department of Labor's final rule defining independent contractors under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So to start, can you give us some background and context on this new rule?
Sure. And thanks for having me. So the new rule under the Biden administration, which has implemented broad policies for protection of workers, is something we've expected, and it's picking up where the Obama administration had left off. Many of you might recall that back during the Obama administration, he formed a joint task force with the IRS and the DOL where there was a work sharing and information sharing agreement to specifically go after potential misclassifications. The dual purpose, obviously, being one, the potential evasion of employer taxes, right, and employee taxes because of the independent contractor classification. But on top of that, workers' rights guaranteed to them under both the FLSA as well as the National Labor Relations Act. So what we're seeing now, Sherelle, is a culmination of the Obama policies being moved forward and retractions from the Trump era policies, which were much more employer friendly.
That's really helpful. So can you talk about how this new rule is going to impact employers and what businesses and what sectors are going to be most impacted by this new rule?
Sure. There's actually no specific targets, although a lot of us have gleamed from the various releases, et cetera, that they are going after gig economy. They're going after hospitality industry. They're going to go after the financial industry, the media industry, and clearly the transportation industry, which is a hotbed for independent contractor classifications. And they're making no bones about it. They are going to start picking off big targets like they want to do in order to make a statement to the business community that they are going to come after you if you misclassify your workers as independent contractors. And right now, the DOL's new rule, which we have to wait to see because it is now the target of litigation seeking to enjoining it as being unconstitutional under the Administration Powers Act, right? So we don't know whether this new rule actually will go into effect in March when it's slated to go into effect, or whether the Fifth Circuit, where this is really pending, is going to stay it pending what happens in briefing. But what I can tell you is a lot of industries are going to really need to look at their services agreements, their independent contractor agreements, and they're going to have to analyze whether or not they have potential issues, which could be far-reaching, right? It
Right.
could be as much as whether you're complying with the FLSA's minimum wage and overtime rules. It could be whether or not you've got 401k issues, whether you've got healthcare benefit issues. And then on top of that, Sherelle, we now have to be worried about whether or not there are unionization issues because the NLRA doesn't cover independent contractors. It covers employees. So you can see how the DOL, the IRS, and now the NLRB are all working together in an effort to ensure that the broadest swath of workers were classified as employees for purposes of getting them under these various laws. And
Mhm.
employers really need to watch out for this going forward into 2024.
Understood. So, Joe, you mentioned that companies should potentially audit their employee classifications and review different services agreements. What else, if you were to provide a list of top two or three considerations that employers should be thinking about or things that they should do to minimize liability in this area, what else comes to mind?
So the biggest factor that both the DOL, the IRS, and now the NLRB are all looking at is control.
Mm.
The new Department of Labor's independent contractor rule lists 6 considerations which we won't go into, but control is being one of the biggest ones.
Mhm.
And entrepreneurial ability to profit and loss, using managerial skill versus manual labor, these are also important factors, but no one factor controls. But in terms of common law agency rules and what we've seen in the past, including what we see in the joint employer context, particularly with franchisors and their relationships with franchisees, is that control seems to be the biggest factor. So if you have an MSA, a master services agreement with a party, and you can glean from that agreement that the prime company, employer, et cetera, has unfettered control as to how the work is done, who's performing the work, who to fire, who to hire, reviewing
Mhm.
background materials, et cetera. You've got an issue and you got to pay close attention to it. Now, having said that, one thing that I think employers really need to be careful about is self-auditing, which should be done through legal counsel, outside counsel, in the best way possible in order to make the review privileged to the
Right.
extent you can. Now, there
Mhm.
are issues with that because the self-critical analysis has been under attack over the last 10 years. But nevertheless, you should be engaging outside counsel to do that. And then in terms of pros and cons, you really have to weigh what reclassification of workers would result in. Because if you look at it from a statute of limitations period, right, which is an ongoing period, every day a worker is misclassified, quote unquote, is another day on the SOL. So you need to be careful and understand, if I reclassify workers as employees, what are the potential damages and liabilities that can flow to us? And that is an in-depth analysis that only counsel should be doing.
Understood. Understood. Well, it sounds like this is going to be a topic that's going to be discussed in depth in 2024. So appreciate you giving us an overview here. And for all of you listening, if you have any questions or for further information on this topic, please reach out to your DLA Piper contact, and also see our recent article that was published on this subject. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time for another episode of Coast to Coast with DLA Piper Employment.